Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles. The series of books and videos on American history is seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Rutherford Hayes, and the focus is one of the good colonels. The year is 1862, and Hayes has been home convalescing with his wife Lucy after the terrible injury he suffered in the Battle of South Mountain. But it's been a couple of months. He's ready to rejoin his comrades, and he's got a new responsibility because he's been promoted to full colonel. The entire regiment is now his responsibility. He's got about 1,900 men under his command, but he doesn't really have anybody to fight. It's getting close to winter time, so he actually takes his men into winter quarters. Lucy and the kids come to visit. They stay for a couple of months, but one of them would not go home. 1-year-old Joseph, their young son, actually died in the camp, so a bit of a tragic moment for Hayes and Lucy at the time. But after she did go back home with the rest of the family, he had the responsibility to get his men ready for the fighting season of 1863. Most of the country was focused on two major battles in 1863. One took place in Pennsylvania near the town of Gettysburg, the other in Mississippi near the town of Vicksburg. Both of these were significant Union victories. They basically changed the course of the war. So that first week of July of 1863, when both of these came to fruition for Union victories, those were great times for the Union Army. Rutherford Hayes was not involved in either of those fights, but he was busy around the same time. There was a Confederate general by the name of John Morgan who was executing raids in and around some of the smaller towns of Ohio and actually creating some terrifying situations. And so Hayes and his men were ordered to put a stop to it. And they finally caught up with Morgan in the town of Gallipolis, which turned out to be a pretty one-sided affair, a rather easy victory for Hayes and his men. Hayes said it called it the liveliest and jolliest campaign we ever had. It was nothing but fun. No serious fighting at all, as the Confederates basically gave up and Hayes had his victory. Well, it was really the only battle of note for Hayes in the entire 1863. Eventually went into winter quarters. Lucy came for another visit. 1864. George Crook was the new boss for Hayes and his men, so it was a pretty significant change. Crook was a different kind of a leader. He was very aggressive, very disciplined, very different personality-wise from Rutherford Hayes, but Hayes loved it. He thought this was a perfect fit and a perfect match, and the leadership of Crook was going to be really important for the fights ahead in 1864. The most immediate task was a tough one. They were ordered to go into Virginia to take out the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad in Dublin, Virginia. That's where they set their eyes on. And they arrived in the area on May the 9th, where they found the enemy really entrenched well at Cloyd's Mountain. Now, Hayes had the Ohio 23rd. He also had the Ohio 36th, the West Virginia 5th, and the West Virginia 6th. A lot of men under his command, and their responsibility was to spearhead this attack. They took heavy casualties, hand-to-hand fighting. In fact, they were just at a point where they were about to fall back based on the Confederate fire on Cloyd's Mountain when just at the right moment, General Crook sent in the reserves that turned the tide, and sure enough, the Union soldiers did have a victory in this battle at Cloyd's Mountain, and it was a big victory because they were able to destroy that railroad, they were able to destroy the railroad station, the nearby military stores, and a 400-foot bridge over called the New River Bridge. They were able to take that out, so it was a significant victory. But they weren't done yet. The hardest part about this fight was actually getting back to the safety of their own lines. The rains came. It made transportation almost impossible to get through the mud. They were running out of food. They were being shot at. This was a tough time. As Hayes said, a terrible, severe day's work. One of the worst in all my experience, he noted on that slow drive to get back to safety. Finally, after a week, they did make it back, and Hayes was really proud. He was proud of his men. He was really proud of his new commander, General Crook. He said this campaign in plan and execution has been perfect. Altogether, this is our finest experience in the war, and General Crook is the best general we have ever served under, not excepting Rosecrans, who was the first general that they had served under. It was actually a perfect combination. Crook is the general and Hayes is the colonel. Hayes maybe thought at times that there were folks thinking about him also as a general officer one day, but Hayes wasn't all that interested. He said, I prefer to be one of the good colonels to being one of the poor generals, and he had the match that was working now with Crook as the general and Hayes as the colonel. Well, another time they had an interesting exchange during this period between Hayes and Lucy. He actually pushed back on Lucy when she wrote him a letter, part of their robust correspondence, in which she called the enemy the brutal rebels. And Hayes really balked at this comment. He rebuked his wife, and he said to her, "There are enough brutal rebels, no doubt. But we have brutal officers and men too. I've had men brutally treated by our own officers on this raid. War is a cruel business, and there is brutality in it on all sides, but it is very idle to get up anxiety on account of any supposed peculiar cruelty on the part of the rebels. Keepers of prisons in Cincinnati as well as in Danville are hard-hearted and cruel." Hayes was able to sort of see through the politics of the war, the big picture, and look at the men. And he could distinguish the men and the cause. And he pushed back on this notion that either side, frankly, was any more brutal than the other. They were men out trying to do the right thing based on what they saw it. And Hayes had sort of this ability to see through the politics of this and actually care for the men on both sides of this really terrible fight. Well, also at this time, Hayes got notice from home that his friends wanted to put his name forward to elect him to the U.S. House of Representatives. And Hayes thought about it for a minute. He said, "Fine, I'm not focusing on this. I got a job to do. I'm fighting a war. If you want to put me up for Congress, that's okay." Well, sure enough, he got the Republican nomination, and then his friend William Smith wrote him a letter and said, "Look, why don't you get a furlough, come home and campaign for Congress?" And at this point, Hayes really said no. According to Hayes, an officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer for Congress ought to be scalped. You may feel perfectly sure I would do no such thing. Well, when they published that quote, you can imagine it was almost assuring the victory for Hayes, but it was surely not his focus, not at this time. The main focus as 1864 was coming along was what was going on in Richmond, Virginia, with Ulysses Grant driving in the Overland Campaign. You got a siege going on around Richmond. You've got General William Sherman, who's trying to take the fight to the Confederates in Georgia. Again, Rutherford Hayes not part of these fights, but he was plenty busy. The Shenandoah Valley Campaign was his focus. Now, this was the northern western portion of Virginia, and Jubal Early was the Confederate general who was fighting in this region. And what he was largely trying to do was to draw soldiers away from these other fights so that give General Lee around Richmond a better chance to win by siphoning off some of the Union resources. At one point, he actually crossed the Potomac. He was going to take the fight directly to the Washington, D.C., to the nation's capital, and that did cause General Grant to send some reinforcements. They eventually met at Fort Stevens, about 5 miles outside of Washington, D.C. The Union line held. Early was sent back into Shenandoah Valley. And that's where Hayes and the Ohio 23rd and others were ready to do battle. And they did for a couple of months throughout of 1864. There were battles at Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry, Snickers Ferry, Keys Ferry. Mostly wins for the Union side, but they did have a setback at Kernstown, and there was just nothing decisive going on. And for this, Ulysses Grant, who's now in charge of the entire Union Army, said, "Enough's enough. I want this stuff going on in Shenandoah Valley to come to an end. I'm taking my cavalry officer, my lead commander there, 33-year-old Phil Sheridan. Sheridan, go to the valley and go win this fight." Well, Sheridan was cut very much from the same mold as a Grant or a Sherman. He was willing to take high casualties to get the ultimate victory, to really take that fight to the enemy and destroy their ability to make war. And that's what he set out to do. It wasn't just with the sword and with the arms. They also decided to burn the territory. Why? Well, Early had cut his supply line and he was living off the land. And Sheridan said, "Not in my area." And they called it Brown October. According to Rutherford Hayes, this valley will feed and forage no more rebel armies. It is completely and awfully devastated. Well, the decisive battle of the Valley Campaign took place in Cedar Creek, October 19, 1864. The Confederates attacked at first light, and sure enough, they caught the Union soldiers off guard, including Hayes and his men, who were literally running for their lives. And when Hayes tried to rally his men to form a defensive line, this was one time where they didn't stop. They kept running to try to get to a point of safety. Eventually, Hayes was able to get them to slow down and form that line. He lost his horse. He was wounded in this fight again. As he said, I was hit fairly on the head by a ball, which had lost its force in getting, I suppose, through somebody else's. This was the fourth time that Rutherford Hayes had been wounded in action. They finally, though, again, it was a relatively minor wound. They were able to form their line at Middletown, and all of a sudden, General Sheridan shows up. He had been a few miles away while this fight was going on, because, again, it kind of caught the Union forces off guard. As soon as he heard about it, he's riding as fast as he can. He shows up, and he's ready to rally his men. There's whooping and hollering, because Sheridan wasn't going to just end the day after this defeat. He was ready for an immediate counterattack, just like a General Grant might do, and sure enough, it was successful. The Confederates were worn out. The Union soldiers forced them all the way back. They got all the territory back from that day. This was a tough day for both sides. There were about 9,000 casualties combined between the two, but with this fight, the Shenandoah Valley Campaign was effectively over. Early had pretty much lost the ability to put up a good fight, pretty much came to an end. Sheridan went back to Grant, but before he did, he put in a promotion. Who for? Rutherford Hayes. Rutherford Hayes was about to become one of those generals. He finally got an opportunity to put a star on his shoulder, and it was dated back to the day of this fight on Cedar Creek. And probably the most proudful moment is General Crook gave him his old brigadier stripes, gave him a chance to put those on his own shoulder, and that was definitely a point of pride coming from someone like Crook, who he respected so much. But there was no fighting for Rutherford Hayes in his tenure as a general officer, because again, the Valley Campaign had pretty much come to an end. People went into winter quarters. They waited to see what was going to happen in the other part of Virginia, and that's exactly where the war came to an end. Where in April of 1865, the siege finally ended as Robert E. Lee tried to take his Confederates on the run away from Grant. Grant tracked him down, and sure enough, Lee eventually surrendered April of 1865. The rest of the Confederates would give in the following month, and the Civil War came to an end. There was certainly celebration, but it was touched with a lot of sadness, because right after Lee had surrendered, just a few days later, Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. This struck everybody, including Rutherford Hayes, who said the contrast between his obscure beginnings and his greatness of his subsequent positions and achievements, his tragic death, giving him almost the crown of martyrdom, elevate him to a place in history second to none other in ancient or modern times. His success in his great office, his hold upon the confidence and affections of his countrymen, we shall all say are only second to Washington's. We shall probably feel and think they are not second even to his, the words of Rutherford Hayes when thinking about the recently assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Well, Hayes and his friends had done the job back home, sending him to Congress. He had heard about this, and so shortly he would be going off into his new realm as the war was coming to this end. Also a time to reflect. The years in the Army for Rutherford Hayes, the best years of his life, and he said, I have no idea that many of them, his comrades, will ever see as happy times as they have had in the Army. That was very much what Rutherford Hayes thought about his experience as well. And what did the others think about him? Again, they thought a lot of him. They really bonded around their colonel, one of the good colonels in the fight who was always alongside. And one of the ones who commented was William McKinley, the other future president from the Ohio 23rd, who started out the war as a private. They stuck around together through most of the war. He ended up as a major on General Crook's staff. In talking about Hayes after the war, McKinley said his whole nature seemed to change when in battle. From the sunny, agreeable, the kind, the generous, the sweet gentleman he was when the battle was once on, intense and ferocious. They respected and liked Rutherford Hayes when he was out of battle and in battle. It was really a great combination. Well, now, though, it was time to transition from the field of battle to the world of politics. And that's the story for another day. That's Rutherford Hayes, and one of the good colonels from the life of Rutherford Hayes. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.